Reactions Matter by David W. Searcy, Jr. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share the video. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the content.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day. It is not snowing, it is sunshiny here in the beautiful state of Colorado. We got us a new Starlink satellite internet provider. Hopefully we don't get lagged as much as we did before. Today we're going to look at 100 facts about the Middle Ages that will give you chills. Another video by my boy Infinity. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment. Say hello. Like the video and then share it. You want to subscribe. Okay, here we go.
Everyone's heard of the Middle Ages, but not everyone knows what exactly they were. How true are the myths about the Middle Ages? And what were we never told about in school? How long did medieval people really live? And how'd they deal with intimate relationships and marriage? What's interesting about hygiene and diseases of the Middle Ages? You'll learn this and much more in this episode. Let's go! Let's start with how long people lived in the Middle Ages. I'm sure you've heard many times that…
Okay, how long do you think people lived in the Middle Ages? Before we even get into this, drop a comment. How long did people live in the Middle Ages?
In the Middle Ages, people barely lived to be 20 or at least 30 years old. A 25-year-old person could be considered an old man, or at least a mature adult. This isn't far from the truth, but it was not quite so. Yes, indeed, in the Middle Ages, people's life expectancy left much to be desired, and this was due to poor medicine, insanitary conditions, constant wars, epidemics, and so on. Child mortality was very high. Many didn't survive childbirth. Many didn't survive to a year or even 10 years of age. This period was the toughest for anyone in the Middle Ages. But the further away, the better it was. The immune system strengthened, and if a person lived to be 20 years old, there was a good chance they'd be old, that is, lived to 60 or 70 years old. There were a lot of such people. People over 60 were not rare in the Middle Ages, and they were not infirm old people. In their 60, 70, or even 80 years, they actively participated in the political and cultural life of their countries. This, of course, mainly concerned the nobility and persons close to them, which is logical, but peasants could live long lives as well.
Anybody could live a long life, right? Just depends on the health of what you had going on.
Another interesting thing associated
Still lagging. Why am I
with
lagging?
age in the Middle Ages is marriage. Countries now set age limits for marriage. Usually you can marry from the age of 18. In the Middle Ages, however, at least the early Middle Ages, there was no such thing. It was believed that as soon as a boy or a girl reached puberty, they could marry. So the marriage of a 14-year-old boy to a 12-year-old girl was not surprising. Noble families arranged marriages even earlier. An adult could be married to a child, but in such cases, the minor spouse stayed with her parents until she reached puberty. As in our time, rings were exchanged and consent to marriage was given. All this was registered by a priest or a monk. Sometimes they even did it without a priest, pronouncing the marriage consent near the church or in its doors. However, since the 12th century, the role of the church became more important. What's also interesting is the role that witnesses played. I mean, they could be present not only at the wedding, but also at the first wedding night of the newlyweds. This was done so that the witness could report it to others, because in the Middle Ages it was often thought that marriage was only formalized after the couple had sexual relationship.
Couple of things right here. So my dad married a Chinese woman, and after you're married in China, the family sits outside the door of the after party to make sure you're doing it right. From what I understand, if they don't hear the right noises, then they come and teach you how to do it properly. Not exactly sure what that's all about. But this really is a thing, which is kind of interesting. So, let's get back to it. Marriage also so I did a bunch of studying of the Bible, and from what I can tell in the Bible, the only thing you can't do outside of marriage that you can do inside of marriage biblically is have sex. So I guess technically whoever you have sex with is who you're married to. If you have more than one sex partner, then I guess you have more than one husband or wife. But if we're all related anyway, then what does that really? Alright, here we go.
Speaking of which, many people consider the Middle Ages to be the most chaste time in history, when sexual relationship was almost forbidden. At least many people think that in the Middle Ages they were allowed solely for procreation, but no more than that. But modern scientists are of a different opinion. They believe that the topic of sexual relationship was one of the main in the lives of medieval people. Medieval doctors warned their patients about the terrible diseases that threatened them if their sexual activity was too low. According to some accounts, a spouse could even accuse her husband of failing to fulfill his marital duty, and if she was proven right, she'd receive her ex-spouse's property. At the same time, a spouse could prove his potency, and then the property would stay with him, and his wife would leave him. How'd he prove it? Scientists believe that he proved it directly in front of witnesses. And can we now say that the Middle Ages were a time of chastity? On the other hand, when the role of the church increased, and this happened closer to the late Middle Ages, the role of sexual relationship became much.
Okay, hold on a second here, buddy. So you got married, and if your wife says you wasn't pleasing her, she could take you to court, and you'd have to have sex in front of all the people to show if you're pleasing her? What?
When the role of the church increased, and this happened closer to the late Middle Ages, the role of sexual relationship became much more taboo, and society became more.
Of course, the church is like, oh, you can't do that.
Chaste. Promiscuity was condemned and censured. Girls were required to behave modestly, and even married women were not supposed to show emotions in bed with their husbands. The act of sexual intimacy was to be seen only as an unpleasant necessity for procreation. But many still disobeyed the church and continued to do things the way they'd been done for centuries. They took risks, of course, but at even greater risk were the people who entered into same-sex relationship. It's been in all times, and the Middle Ages are no exception. In some countries, such as Italy, there were even special taverns where people of the same sex could gather and become intimate with each other.
Did you hear that? So in the Middle Ages, they had gay bars.
Well, let's leave this topic because we usually associate the Middle Ages with other things, like what? If you're thinking of witches, you're right. Witches and the Middle Ages are something that are inextricably linked. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that a woman became a witch by making a pact with the devil. It was believed that witches participated in Sabbaths, communicated with evil forces, and so on. In general, I must say that in the Middle Ages, it was extremely difficult for women because literally any of them could be considered a witch. Women in general were considered more sinful than men, so they could easily be accused of witchcraft. Also, almost all elderly women were considered potential witches. Often, witchcraft activity was attributed to the homeless and beggars. Those who didn't have their own home, wandered, begged, were not trusted, because they could come into contact with people to harm them. That's why they were often arrested for witchcraft. The presence of friends or money, the presence or absence of children, strange behavior, and various bodily defects. A girl could be considered a witch if at least some of the above was in her life. Interestingly, witch hunts took place already in the late Middle Ages and even in modern times. The Holy Inquisition was in charge of witch hunts. Inquisitors could only be monks who were forced to be celibate, so it wasn't surprising that many women, in their opinion, were shown as vicious creatures seeking carnal pleasures and having made a deal with the devil. Witch hunts reached their peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, but this is no longer considered the Middle Ages. By the way, it was then that the notorious Salem witch trials took place, and it didn't even happen in Europe, where everyone were chasing witches, but in America. 20 people were executed, and about 200 more were imprisoned.
Isn't that crazy? People don't like what you do, so they just, you're a witch. And they make a conspiracy. You can't just kill somebody because you think they're a witch. What the hell? Unless you, oh, I'm not going to get into that right now.
The Middle Ages is a time not only of witches, but of course of knights. This is the hallmark of the Middle Ages in general. After all, we all know this image of a warrior in armor who fights with a sword, a spear, and a shield. But who were knights actually? He wasn't just any warrior, as one might think. A knight was a nobleman, that is, a wealthy man with a plot of land. He was indebted to the state and went to war and on military campaigns at the first call. In fact, he was a professional military man who had to always be in good physical shape. In the Middle Ages, chivalry was synonymous with justice, defense of the weak, and valor. Indeed, there were valiant knights, but scientists believe that the bulk of knights didn't possess this quality. They perceived battles not as something sacred, but as usual work. In addition, many knights have never missed an opportunity to engage in robbery or looting, and this doesn't really fit valor and justice. In battle, a knight wielded a sword or a spear. As for the spear, it was usually very heavy. So heavy that a warrior could not throw it. He could only put it in front of him and try to knock down the enemy at a gallop. Knights were saved from sword blows by their armor. Some people believe that the armor was so heavy that the knight could hardly move wearing it, couldn't put it on himself, and relied only on the help of his squire. Knights did have squires, but they rather helped the warriors to keep an eye on their weapons and uniforms. They also helped to put on and take off the armor, but it wasn't so difficult. A knight could put on his battle outfit in a few minutes, not hours, as many people mistakenly think. Another myth is connected with the armor. Allegedly, knights walked in them for months and accordingly never washed, relieved themselves directly in the armor and stuff. This is only partially true. Yes, in long military campaigns they had to do without a bath, but many of the armor were arranged so that the knight could at least relieve himself. Actually, there are also enough myths about hygiene in the Middle Ages in general.
So knights.
Again, not everything is unambiguous. In the ancient world, a lot of attention was paid to hygiene. One can remember public baths in ancient Rome, and not only. But with the decline of civilizations and the onset of the Middle Ages, there were changes in the consciousness of people. The belief spread that diseases penetrated the human body through the skin, and regular washing thereby increases the chances of infection. Over time, hygiene was greatly forgotten. Many people almost stopped washing, and they bathed literally several times a year. Only underwear was sent to the laundry, while outerwear was simply brushed. It's believed that it was then that the perfume appeared and became fashionable. With its help, people struggled with unpleasant odors. They also fought dirt in original ways. For example, with the help of dogs. Modern scientists believe that toy dogs became popular in the Middle Ages. If in our time ladies have such dogs as a living decoration and a symbol of aristocracy, then in the Middle Ages toy dogs had to fight with insanitary conditions. They were needed to pull fleas and other parasites from the owner, which they successfully coped with. Still, one can't say that in the Middle Ages things were very dirty and people didn't bathe at all. That changed over time. After the Crusaders visited the Middle East, they returned to Europe with the custom of washing regularly, which they borrowed from the Arabs. However, taking a bath in the Middle Ages was not something pleasant. They often had to take a bath in cold water. Only the rich and the nobility could afford hot baths. In this case, the water was often heated with the help of firewood, which was burned directly under the bathtub or other container. There was no such thing as fancy body care products back then. In the Middle Ages, they also took care of their teeth, but of course not as effectively as we do now. Instead of toothpaste, for example, they used ashes, charcoal, or tar. People also used herbal rinses. Of course, dental disease was very common back then. However, they were not always fought. For example, tooth decay was considered a noble disease. It meant that a person could eat sweet foods, which were then considered rare, and therefore they were wealthy. Poor people and peasants had far fewer dental problems because their diet consisted of coarse plant foods without sweets. The Middle Ages.
So if you want to take care of your teeth back in the day, you just ate coarse plant food, huh? Okay.
Ages can be called the time of people with alcohol addiction, at least partially. The fact is that low-alcohol drinks were then one of the most popular drinks. Many scientists believed that the medieval human was always tipsy. And not because they liked to drink so much that they couldn't stop, it's just that water in the Middle Ages and water now are two different things. Now we can buy clean water at the grocery store or use a home filter. And in many countries, even tap water is clean. In the Middle Ages, water was dirty and unfit for drinking. Instead of water, people drank home brew, beer, or wine because the alcohol contained in these drinks at least partially disinfected the bacteria in the water. At the same time, it should not be assumed that in the Middle Ages people drank only alcohol. They drank water too. People knew how to boil it, suspecting that this way it becomes less dangerous. In addition, it was in the Middle Ages that various decoctions became popular, which they would not have been able to make without boiled hot water.
Wow.
Experience China before communism. The life-changing performance. Shen Yun.
No. Did they have tea right there?
Given what was going on in the Middle Ages, it's not surprising that many people were often sick, and it was impossible to do without the help of doctors. Doctors treated them with the decoctions I told you about. But if the disease was more serious, the treatment was much more serious as well, and more painful at that. The most important method was bloodletting. This procedure was used in literally every case. Sometimes the patient could be covered with leeches all over their body. It was unpleasant but bearable. But there were also more gruesome methods of treatment, from putting the patient in very hot water and treating hemorrhoids with a red-hot iron to drilling a small hole in the skull and removing teeth without anesthesia. In general, anesthesia in the Middle Ages existed, but left much to be desired. The patient still felt much of what the healer did to them. By the way, medieval doctors considered washing hands before examining patients an unnecessary bliss. It wasn't until centuries later that they realized they were wrong. This is partly why diseases spread very quickly in epidemic-stricken cities.
So they weren't even smart enough to realize that.
Speaking of which, the most famous epidemic of the Middle Ages was, of course, the plague. Or rather, it was a whole pandemic. I'm talking about the Black Death. That's the name by which it went down in history. It peaked in the mid-14th century. It was a hellish disease that wiped out 30 to 60% of the population of all of Europe. It's believed that the Black Death may have claimed the lives of 200 million people. This plague was fought by plague doctors, the one who wore masks with a beak. The beak contained various herbs that were meant to protect the doctor themselves, at least partially. However, the pneumatic form of the plague spread through the air, and the aromatic herbs didn't really save the doctors. The mortality rate among them was still high. In general, it's believed that plague doctors, in most cases, were only apprentice surgeons and trainees beginning their careers. Therefore, they didn't even try to treat the sick, but instead transported and buried people, registered the dead and infected for statistics, and took the last will and testament of dying people.
That's crazy.
Given the incredible number of people who died in the Middle Ages, it's logical to assume that there should be an immeasurable amount of remains. There must have been literally mountains of skeletons and skulls, and there are. They're called ossuaries. In general, it's a box, can, or well for storing skeletonized remains. But sometimes you can find whole walls miles long. The number of places in cemeteries was limited, so after a certain time the remains were removed and reburied in the form of skeletons. These were ossuaries. And new people were buried in the cemetery. Ossuaries were usually built at churches and chapels, but one can also find gigantic catacombs of such burials. As a result of all these manipulations, there was a very nasty odor in
your parents, I mean, nobody's going to keep coming
the burial places, and contagion spread quickly. The cemeteries of the Middle Ages themselves also deserve special attention. At times, they were huge. Not all of them have been found so far, and archaeologists continue to dig up some mass graves to this day. But medieval cemeteries are interesting not only for this. If in our time a cemetery is a place of grief and sorrow, then a few centuries ago in Europe, cemeteries were lively places. It wasn't just a plot of land where people were buried, it was a center of social activity. At times, a cemetery could replace an entire town square in terms of holding some kind of event. Many town and village events took place in cemeteries, such as elections, sermons, public debates, trials, and plays. And at night, they became a place of activity for ladies of the night. The Middle Ages were a very strange and unusual time. We usually associate the word medieval with images such as knights, castles, healers, witch burnings, and so on. But this is the European view of the time. But the Middle Ages were also in Asia, for example in Japan. And now I'll tell you about a powerful and brave samurai whom no one could defeat. The most powerful samurai in history was born in 1584. He was known as Shinmen Takezo, Miyamoto ben Nasuke, and Naiten Doraku, but he's remembered by the world as Miyamoto Musashi. Miyamoto's father was Shinmen Munatsai, a master swordsman and the Jute master who devoted his life to the martial arts. Little Miyamoto was destined to become a great warrior. Miyamoto began his journey as a warrior very early. He was trained in sword fighting by his father, and his uncle taught the future legend various martial arts, reading, poetry, and philosophy.
Hey, right now we're giving this mini solar generator away for free.
Miyamoto had his first fight already at the age of 13 and won a confident victory against a strong opponent. The second duel Miyamoto has spent at the age of 16 against well-known Akime Tadashime, whom Miyamoto crushed in fight. Miyamoto acquired a taste and traveled to Kyoto, the then capital of Japan, where he began to defeat elite fighters and martial arts experts. He traveled throughout the country, practicing the martial arts and participating in deadly duels. Musashi's samurai career lasted until the age of 29. During that time, he fought more than 60 duels and won all of them. No one could ever defeat the legendary samurai. In parallel with his fights, Miyamoto was engaged in education and passed on his knowledge to others. In 24, he wrote a treatise on the art of the sword and also founded his own school. Miyamoto's last duel was against the famous Kojiro, another samurai legend. Miyamoto was famous for his unique strategies in preparation for and during combat. This battle took place on the island of Ganryojima, where Miyamoto arrived by boat. On the way, he made a wooden sword from a spare oar. Despite the fact that Kojiro had a real sharp sword, Miyamoto was not afraid to go up against him with a wooden sword. The legendary samurai provoked Kojiro to the first blow, seized the moment, and delivered a fatal blow to his opponent. This battle was the last for Miyamoto, and probably the most important. In general, some sources write that Miyamoto once participated in a battle in which he survived and 70,000 men did not. But this is probably an exaggeration. However, the legendary samurai was indeed strong and didn't lose a single battle. Why is that? First of all, Miyamoto was an excellent and skilled swordsman. From an early age, he trained regularly with the sword and honed his technique. He used almost every sword successfully, from the long katana to the short wakizashi. In fact, Miyamoto is considered the founder of the two-sword combat technique. Second, Miyamoto defeated his opponents psychologically. The duel with Kojiro is a great example. According to the legend, Miyamoto was deliberately several hours late to the duel in order to make his rival nervous, angry, and burned out. In many ways, this is what
That's a good
led to
strategy.
Kojiro making the first
Alright,
lunge,
time
wanting to
for-
deal with Miyamoto as soon as possible. But excessive emotion in battles always leads to defeat, which is what happened in this case. Third, Miyamoto devoted a lot of time to the philosophy of the warcraft and reflected on combat as a sage, not as a mere military man.
Right.
In essence, Miyamoto took the Bushido samurai code to a new level and generally revolutionized the world of martial arts. After that
There's
very
more
battle
to
with
it than-
Kojiro, he decided to retire from fighting and went in search of profound truth. At the age of 50, he enlightened and found the Way, and near the end of his life, he wrote the treatise The Book of Five Rings, in which he described sword techniques, described wars and conflicts, and shared all of his experience. Even today, the Book of Five Rings is very popular and has an impact on the world of martial arts. Miyamoto Musashi died in 1645 at the age of 61. He passed away as an undefeated warrior who had derived universal rules of embattling. His Book of Five Rings teaches not only military tactics, but also helps one find perfection in general. Even after 400 years, this book can be useful in comprehending many areas, from science to
Martial
various
arts is all
crafts.
about-
So it could safely be said Miyamoto Musashi was not only a legendary and powerful warrior, but also a man who changed the world. By the way, Miyamoto himself was not a samurai, but rather a ronin, the name given to a samurai who lost his master or failed to protect the master from death, after which he had to wander, roam, and beggar. Chances are many of you have heard about who the ronins were, but I'm sure you don't know many other interesting facts about medieval Japanese warriors. Stay tuned to find out how samurai lived. Speaking of samurai solely as warriors is not quite right. Samurai were not simply medieval soldiers who defended the emperor and their masters, but an entire class. To some extent, one could say that the samurai were similar to medieval European knights, but this comparison is not entirely accurate. Originally, samurai were called the servants of aristocrats who held military posts in peacetime. These servants were mainly engaged in farm work and escorting their masters to various official events. For a long time between military conflicts, samurai continued to farm. In doing so, they were practically no different from the rest of the country's farmers. Their only privilege was the right to bear arms. In general, samurai had not only to farm, but basically to make extra money in various ways, because their salaries were, to put it mildly, not very good. Despite the fact that samurai were often perceived as the elite of medieval Japanese society, in terms of finances, they were almost at the bottom. In medieval Japan, a person's wealth was measured on the koku. The annual income was measured not in money or area of property, but in the amount of rice. One koku was equal to 150 kilograms of rice. So, while the shoguns, who were the rulers of Japan at the height of the samurai era, received about 2.5 million koku a year, an ordinary samurai could count only 30 koku, or 4.5 tons of rice per year. It was even worse for ordinary infantry soldiers, who were paid only 4 koku a year. Nevertheless, it was all ranked. The better a samurai was, the more he got.
Still seems a lot
Still,
of
these
rice.
warriors had obvious problems with their finances.
4
Training.
tons.
Yet we do not associate samurai primarily with farming and part-time work, but with warfare. Indeed, samurai were mighty and very brave warriors. They began to train literally from the cradle. From about the age of 3, they began to learn martial arts and swordsmanship techniques. Their parents raised the future samurai not only as a brave warrior, but also as a humble and honorable man who should be loyal to his master, whom a samurai considered the most important person in his life. The training of samurai usually ended at the age of 15, and by the age of 18, samurai could already take part in battles. Not only did samurai's filigree swordsmanship and bravery help them win their battles, but also their special armor. It's difficult to confuse samurai armor with a typical knight's armor. That of a knight was more cumbersome. The Japanese armor consisted of more than 20 steel plates coated with varnish against rust and with leather glued on them. In the classic armor, the plates themselves were almost invisible because of the abundant silk lacing that covered almost the entire surface of the plates. Japanese military ammunition was much lighter than knights' armor. It weighed about 12 to 15 kilograms and gave more freedom of movement and maneuvering in battle. Clad in armor, samurai could even run and swim freely. The armor and weapons were carefully cared for, and their combat qualities and external beauty were not lost, as they were handed down from generation to generation. One of the main reasons samurai were so tough was the Bushido moral code, the way of the warrior, which every samurai followed. Its essence was that a samurai should always be ready to die, not fear death, be brave, modest, and restrained, and most importantly, loyal to his master. It was especially important for a samurai to honor his master. No wonder these warriors were so loyal. If a samurai realized that he'd made a mistake, failed to follow the code, or disgraced himself in any way, he committed harikiri. This is how he showed his courage in the face of pain and death. There were women among samurai. They were called onamusha. The main duty of onamusha was to serve their spouse and protect their homes and children from enemies, so they kept their weapons above the front door. The girls, like their spouses, were taught absolute loyalty to their immediate superior in the clan hierarchy, and just like the men, they were obligated to unconditionally fulfill all orders, including those involving the use of weapons. Not only women could become samurai, but even non-Japanese men. That's right, foreigners could become samurai. A good example is the movie The Last Samurai, where Tom Cruise's character was essentially accepted into samurai clan. It wasn't easy for Tom Cruise's character, but in reality it was even more difficult. A Westerner could only become a samurai if the shogun allowed him to join the clan. This rarely happened. A foreigner had to make an incredible effort to prove his loyalty and willingness to fight on the shogun's side, but sometimes he succeeded. At least 4 foreign samurai are known. The most iconic was the Englishman William Adams. He not only distinguished himself in the art of warfare, but also took the place of the main advisor to the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate named Tokugawa Ieyasu. His story has inspired several books and films, including The Last Samurai. That's all, guys. Would you like to be a samurai in medieval Japan?
What do you think? Samurai versus a knight. That would be an interesting fight. One's going to be power, one's going to be speed. So it's just kind of, all right. Well, there you go.